He is the national security analyst for the Clarion Project, clarionproject.org. Our good friend Ryan Morrow joins us. How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Crane?
I'm doing great, man. And I've got to ask you real quick. I know we're going to talk about Syria, but Jake Taparoo spoke with John Kerry about Iran. And I wanted to ask, I thought it was a great question. He says to Secretary of State Kerry, he says, have we been duped? And I'll play the clip for you and then get your thoughts. Roll it.
Have we been played?
Not in the least. Not even by a close margin. In fact, uh, I think the Iranians naturally are going to go home and say what you've just said.
Sure, but to the world and the Turks and the French?
No, Iran is not open for business. And Iran knows it's not open for business. We have announced increased sanctions against particular companies since this agreement was reached. We have told the Iranians that we will continue to apply the sanctions, and we have made it clear to every other country that the sanctions regime remains in place. So while the French may send some business people over there, they're not able to contravene the sanctions. They will be sanctioned if they do, and they know it, and we put them on notice. But nobody should doubt for an instant that the United States is prepared to enforce the sanctions that exist, and all of our allies are in agreement that those sanctions are staying in place until or unless there is a deal.
On notice, hey, we haven't been played. We haven't been duped. Ryan Morrow, do you agree with the Secretary of State's assessment?
Well, it's possible that he wasn't duped because I think that in order to consciously mislead the country, as President Obama did in that State of the Union address, he has to know exactly what's wrong with the deal and cover it up. And so in the State of the Union address, which I'm going to focus on just because it's a good example of how we're only being told half the story, it was very clear what President Obama was trying to do. And I think the classic example is when he said that the program has been rolled back. It hasn't been really rolled back. Everything's reversible. He said that the centrifuges, the advanced ones, aren't being installed. And that's true, but they are being built. And so you're only being told half the story. And yes, Iran is open for business because otherwise you wouldn't have companies spending such a huge amount of money sending their representatives over there.
So, bottom line, I focusing in on the fact that they're still doing what they're doing. Iran, in the sense of business and the sanctions not working. Kerry moved to part two of it in speaking to the sanctions that even Democrats are supporting against a Democratic president when it comes to Iran, additional sanctions to be put on if they violate the agreement. Here is Secretary of State John Kerry. Roll it.
I believe it's a mistake now to break faith with a negotiating process when you're in the middle of the process. The United States of America agreed, together with our P5+1 allies, with Russia, China, France, Great Britain, Germany, all of them agreed that during the time we're negotiating, we would not increase sanctions. Now, our word has to mean something too, but we don't want to break our word in the middle of the negotiations. We also have other alternatives available to us. We've lost nothing off the table, but we want to give diplomacy a chance.
So, go ahead, Ryan. I just curious on that. Your thoughts.
Sure. Well, first of all, notice the contradiction in what he said in the earlier clip and the clip that you just played. In the other clip, he boasted about the fact that the Obama administration has increased sanctions on the Iranian specific entities. And then later on, he says, well, we can't hit them with more sanctions because that jeopardizes the deal. Well, which is it? We know that the Treasury Department under Obama has hit some more entities with sanctions, yet that's the very action that he's saying Republicans and Democrats should not be pursuing because it can jeopardize the deal. So there's a very blatant contradiction there.
Ryan, when we're talking about Iran, we're talking about the one half, or I would say the foundation, when it comes to the state sponsor of terrorism, Islamic terrorism as we know it, Khomeini's belief, and they will support Sunnis, obviously, and Hamas, 40% of their funding. I'm just reading the facts that you've put out in your articles over the years. And so when I say these things, I want people to know that Ryan is a tremendous resource, and he writes about this, and he gives us perspective. Because when we hear about things like Iran and the deal with the nuke with Iran, and we're going to get to Israel in just a moment, we also hear about Syria and our policy there, and our red line, and the crossing of the red line, and holding Assad accountable for the use of chemical weapons, and the fact that, oh, there's nobody really we can support there because we're basically having Al-Qaeda versus Assad. And can't they both lose? Ronald Reagan, 1984, with speaking to the Iran-Iraq war. Bottom line, you told us that Assad is manipulating the situation and to stay in power and to game the system so he will end up being the victor. Everybody acting in their own self-interest. It's an amazing concept, human nature. It seems quite obvious, but at times, domestic policy, we certainly see a blindness to it, oftentimes willful. Foreign policy, we seem to see a blindness to it. And also, we have an attitude that, hey, look, we're war-weary, we're tired, we don't want any American blood or treasure spent on places that prop up dictators or terror states that are theocracies. So, Ryan, you said something on Thursday, or perhaps it was Wednesday. It's been a long week and a lot of stuff has taken place, but I do remember you saying, yeah, there are people we can support in Syria. There are people that will be allies of ours. And while they're not Jeffersonian Democrats, they're certainly not terrorists, and they desire to be free, much like we saw with the opposition to Morsi in Egypt. Your thoughts?
Yes, I agree with all of my previous statements you cited.
I love you, man. That's great.
Well, but basically, yeah, I mean, the overall point is true. That's not all Syrian rebels are the same. There are secular, more moderate ones that I've been in contact with. There's some that on a 1 to 10 scale are a 10 in terms of how bad they are. There's others that are a 5. There's some that are a 7. And we live in an imperfect world, and we have to say what's going to best advance our interests. As for the game of manipulation that you referred to earlier, before the Civil War began, Assad would support Al-Qaeda and other Islamic terrorists and then hold them up and say, that's the reason the West needs me, so that I can beat these guys, even though he was supporting them. And you want to create this illusion that we had to choose between him or them. After the Civil War began and Al-Qaeda and him really started going at each other's throats, there were still some Syrian rebels saying, look, Assad is still backing Al-Qaeda, but that is to be expected. Of course they're going to say that, right? But then later, the Obama administration actually came out with the information that Al-Qaeda cells in Iran were sending fighters to Syria. Now, how does that make sense? Iran is backing the Assad dictatorship, but then backing the Al-Qaeda fighters fighting it? What's going on here? The game is the same thing as what was going on before. The Iranian regime and Assad want Al-Qaeda to dominate the rebel forces because that keeps a certain amount of the population afraid of the rebels, and it stops the West from coming to the rebel side. It's a very smart strategy.
What can we do?
Well, the best thing that we can do is, first of all, every single Al-Qaeda member, especially in Syria, deserves to be on some type of target list, sanction them. Just don't tolerate any of them. And the reason I mention that is because of the news that the Obama administration is now stopping adding members of Al-Qaeda to the kill list in Pakistan, so that the list goes shorter and shorter as individuals get killed. So obviously we have to take on Al-Qaeda, but more importantly, there has to be an ideological distinction between who our allies are and who our enemies are. If you're an Islamist, you want a Sharia-based government, you have to be treated as an enemy, and there's no point of having contact with the U.S. If you oppose that and you want a secular democracy, then no matter how weak you are, you should have a reliable link to the U.S. government, or at least the U.S. should be willing to offer that.
Is the problem here? I mean, could you draw an analogy to what the Cold War was and what we are fighting today and the way that we are being communicated about the war that we are in? Because it seems to me a big part of this is the absence of the use of the bully pulpit by the president, speaking to what we stand for and targeting organizations and groups and people who stand for the same thing and supporting them and using our resources that way. And I think that begins first and foremost by supporting our allies like Israel. Your thoughts?
Right, that's definitely true. Whereas during the Cold War, we allied with anyone that was anti-communist. In some cases, it was even counterproductive over the long term for us to do so, but that was the strategy. That was the distinction. Now, there's basically this debate where the Obama administration has decided to frame it as, if you are against Al-Qaeda, then we're probably with you. What I argue is that the strategy should be, are you against the Islamists, then we're probably with you. That the spectrum has to be broader than just Al-Qaeda, and that's why you have the Obama administration, Senator John McCain on the Republican side, all these individuals that will support the Muslim Brotherhood, bash their enemies, all in the name of democracy, because they say, well, as long as they participate in elections and they condemn Al-Qaeda, then we're willing to work with them, and that's the standard.
And isn't the great clarifier at times a horrible attack? I mean, I'm not wishing. I pray again. I pray that it never happens again. In the mass way or any way to American citizens. But all of a sudden, everybody got real clear on who our enemy was, and there's really nothing that's changed in that other than proximity to the time it took place. Does distance from the attack allow us to see gray when it's truly black and white? Final question, go.
It makes us complacent, but I would say that that's actually not true. That on 9/11 we woke up to Al-Qaeda, but we didn't wake up to all the different strains of radical Islam.
Excellent point. Ryan Morrow, ClarionProject.org. You have a great weekend, buddy. Thanks so much.